What happens when the most feared mob boss in New York decides he's completely sick of plastic smiles and gold-digging supermodels? He strips away his blood-soaked designer suits, puts on torn rags, and begs on the freezing streets of Brooklyn. Dozens walk right past him. Some spat at his feet. The skinny, flawless women he used to date called him human trash. But then came Beatrice, a plus-size bakery manager with a worn coat and a heart too big for this cruel city. She didn't see a terrifying criminal. She saw a starving human being. She had no idea she had just passed the ultimate test set by the most dangerous man alive. Stick around, because the twists in this story are about to get wild. Nathaniel Sterling wiped a speck of blood from his $4,000 Rolex. At 32, he was the undisputed head of the Sterling Syndicate, a criminal empire that controlled everything from the shipping docks of Manhattan to the underground casinos of Atlantic City. He had wealth that rivaled small nations, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and the kind of power that made politicians sweat. Yet, as he looked around the VIP lounge of his flagship club filled with stunning size 0 models and calculating associates, he felt absolutely nothing. Every woman who threw herself at him did so for the platinum card in his pocket, or the dangerous allure of his name. Last week he caught his stunning fiancée, Victoria Belmont, complaining to her friends about how she couldn't wait for a rival family to put a bullet in him so she could inherit his offshore accounts. He had quietly broken the engagement, seized her assets, and exiled her from the city, but the betrayal left a bitter, hollow taste in his mouth. "They're all the same, Dominic," Nathaniel murmured to his underboss, who stood stoically by the door. "Vultures in silk dresses, they see the money, the cars, the power. If I were nobody, bleeding in the gutter, they'd step right over me." "That's the world we built, Nate," Dominic replied smoothly. "Loyalty is bought, love is a liability." "I want to know if it actually exists," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "Real compassion, unconditional decency." The next morning, Nathaniel Sterling ceased to exist. Gone was the tailored Brioni suit and the slicked-back hair. In his place stood Nate, a homeless ex-convict wearing a threadbare army jacket, scuffed boots held together by duct tape, and a thick layer of grime smeared across his jaw. He chose a bitter, wind-swept corner in Brooklyn, far from his usual haunts, and sat on a piece of damp cardboard. He placed a dented paper cup in front of him. The test was simple. He would sit there for 3 days. Whoever showed him genuine kindness, without knowing he had $1 billion in the bank, would be rewarded. For the first 2 days, humanity disappointed him exactly as he expected. Hundreds of people walked by. A group of wealthy college girls in designer leggings openly laughed at him, taking a selfie with him in the background. Businessmen ignored his existence. One woman, strikingly beautiful and thin, actively kicked his paper cup over because it was blocking the sidewalk. Nathaniel's heart grew colder by the hour. Dominic was right. The world was rotten. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sky opened up, pouring freezing November rain. Nathaniel was shivering, his muscles cramping. He was ready to call Dominic to pick him up. Then the bell of the struggling bakery behind him jingled. Beatrice Hayes stepped out into the rain. She wasn't built like the women in Nathaniel's world. Beatrice was a heavy woman, carrying her weight with a quiet, defensive posture, as if she was used to taking up less space so people wouldn't stare. She had soft, round cheeks, exhausted brown eyes, and wore a faded purple coat that was straining at the buttons. She worked as the manager at Sugar and Spice, a bakery that had seen better days, taking the brunt of her cruel boss's anger and her co-worker Peyton's endless fat-shaming remarks. Beatrice locked the door and opened a battered umbrella. She paused, looking down at Nathaniel, who was huddled against the brick wall, drenched to the bone. Nathaniel braced himself for the usual look of disgust. He knew how he smelled. He knew how he looked. But Beatrice didn't sneer, Her eyes softened with profound empathy. She didn't just toss a quarter into his cup. She knelt down right in the puddles, ruining her cheap stockings to be at eye level with him. "You must be freezing," she said, her voice like warm honey, completely devoid of pity or condescension. "I'm fine," Nathaniel rasped, playing his part, though his teeth were legitimately chattering. Beatrice reached into her oversized tote bag. She pulled out a large foil-wrapped package. "I was going to take this home for dinner, but I think you need it more than I do. It's a turkey and cranberry sandwich and some hot potato soup." She unscrewed the lid of a thermal thermos and poured the steaming soup into its cup, handing it to him. Nathaniel stared at the food. His stomach, empty for 2 days, rumbled violently. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "You don't look like you have much to spare." Beatrice offered a gentle, self-deprecating smile that made her eyes crinkle. "My co-worker Peyton told me I need to skip dinner anyway if I ever want to fit into a nice dress. But honestly, nobody deserves to be cold and hungry. Not in this city. Eat it while it's hot." Before Nathaniel could say another word, Beatrice reached out and gently pulled the collar of his damp jacket closer to his neck. The brief touch of her warm, soft fingers sent an inexplicable jolt of electricity straight through Nathaniel's chest. It had been years since someone touched him gently without wanting something in return. "I'm Beatrice," she said softly. "Nate," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay safe, Nate," she said, standing up and handing him her battered umbrella. "Eat this. I live 2 blocks away. I can run." Without waiting for a thank you, the overweight, exhausted bakery manager jogged away into the freezing rain, leaving the most ruthless mafia boss in the country staring after her, a hot thermos in his hands and a sudden fierce warmth blooming in his dark heart. He pulled a burner phone from his pocket and dialed his underboss. "Dominic," Nathaniel said, his eyes still fixed on the corner where Beatrice had disappeared. "The test is over. I've found her." For the next 2 weeks, Nathaniel Sterling lived a double life. By night, he was the terrifying phantom of the New York underworld, ruthlessly crushing a Russian cartel that dared to encroach on his territory, ordering hits and laundering millions. But by day, he slipped back into his thrift store clothes and returned to the alley beside Sugar and Spice. He didn't beg anymore. He simply sat on a crate, reading a battered paperback, waiting for Beatrice. And Beatrice never failed him. Every morning at 6 a.m. she would arrive to unlock the bakery, lugging heavy bags of flour. Nathaniel tried to help her once, but she stubbornly refused, laughing breathlessly as she carried the 50-pound sacks herself. She brought him fresh coffee, day-old muffins, and most importantly, conversation. Nathaniel learned everything about her. He learned that Beatrice was deeply insecure about her weight, having been bullied her whole life. He learned she had a passion for creating intricate, beautiful pastries. But the bakery's owner, a cheap tyrant named Mr. Harrison, forced her to bake cheap, stale bread instead. He also learned she was drowning in medical debt from her late mother's cancer treatments. He watched his blood boiling as society treated her with 1,000 tiny paper cuts. He saw customers push past her in line. He listened to her thin-veined co-worker Peyton Dempsey make passive-aggressive comments. "Honestly, Bayer," Peyton sneered one Tuesday afternoon, while Nathaniel sat near the open back door out of sight. "If you didn't eat the profit margin, maybe Mr. Harrison would give you a raise. Look at you, you're pouring out of that apron." Nathaniel's hand instinctively reached for the sleek, suppressed 9mm pistol hidden in the waistband of his jeans beneath his oversized coat. He wanted to drag Peyton out by her hair and make her swallow glass. But then he heard Beatrice's quiet, shaking voice. "I don't eat the inventory, Peyton, and I'm doing the best I can." Nathaniel pulled his hand away from his gun, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. He needed her to fall for Nate the vagrant, not Nathaniel the mobster. But his restraint was pushed to the absolute limit 3 days later. It was a Friday evening. The sky was dark, and a relentless drizzle painted the Brooklyn streets black. Beatrice was closing up the bakery alone. Nathaniel was waiting across the street in the shadows, intending to walk behind her and ensure she got to her apartment safely. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the alley. Nathaniel sprinted across the street, moving with a silent, lethal grace that belonged in a war zone, not a bakery. He peeked through the back window. Inside, 3 men wearing leather jackets with snake emblems the local street gang known as the Cobras had backed Beatrice against the industrial ovens. They were shaking down the neighborhood businesses for protection money. "Listen to me, Porky," the leader, a scarred thug named Jax, hissed, knocking a rack of freshly baked tarts onto the floor. Beatrice flinched, her eyes wide with terror, but she planted her feet firmly. "Harrison owes us $2,000. Since he ain't here, you're gonna open that register, or we're gonna see how much heat you can take from this oven." Jax grabbed Beatrice roughly by the arm. She cried out in pain. That was it. The leash snapped. Nathaniel kicked the reinforced back door so hard the metal frame buckled and burst open. The 3 thugs spun around, surprised by the sudden intrusion. They saw a grimy, homeless man standing in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair. "Get lost, trash," Jack sneered, pulling a switchblade. Nathaniel didn't speak. He simply stepped into the room, his eyes dead and cold. Jax lunged, swinging the blade. In a fraction of a second, Nathaniel sidestepped, grabbed Jax's wrist, and twisted it with a sickening crack. The thug screamed as his arm broke in 3 places. The other 2 rushed him. Nathaniel moved like a blur of targeted violence. A brutal strike to the throat dropped the second man, leaving him gasping for air on the floor. The third man pulled a cheap handgun, but Nathaniel was faster. He closed the distance, grabbed the gun by the barrel, stripped it from the man's grip, and drove his knee into the man's ribs, cracking bone. In less than 10 seconds, 3 armed gang members were groaning and bleeding on the floor. Nathaniel stood over them, his chest heaving, his knuckles bruised. He turned slowly to look at Beatrice, expecting to see sheer horror in her eyes. He had revealed too much. He had fought like a highly trained assassin. Beatrice was trembling, her hands clamped over her mouth. She looked at the bodies, then at Nathaniel. "Nate," she whispered, Are you okay?" She didn't care about the violence. She cared about him. "I'm fine," he grunted, forcing his posture to relax, pretending to wince. I got into a lot of bar fights back in the day. Let's get out of here before they wake up." Beatrice quickly grabbed her coat, locked the front of the shop, and hurried out the back. Instead of running away from him, she grabbed his bruised hand. "My apartment. It's close. We need to ice your hand." Her apartment was tiny, situated above a noisy laundromat, but it was spotless. It smelled warmly of vanilla extract and cinnamon. Her books were stacked everywhere, and the small sewing machine sat on a table in the corner. It was a home. Beatrice guided him to a worn sofa. She brought a bowl of warm water, antiseptic, and bandages. As she knelt in front of him, cleaning the scrapes on his knuckles, Nathaniel felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. "You shouldn't have done that," she murmured, dabbing a cut. "They could have killed you, Nate." "They were hurting you, Bea," he said softly, using her nickname for the first time. "I couldn't let them do that." She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his steely gray ones. A heavy, pregnant silence filled the small room. She was so close he could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. For a moment, the weight of her insecurities and the darkness of his secrets seemed to vanish. "Nobody has ever stood up for me," Beatrice whispered, a tear slipping down her plump cheek. "People usually just look away." Nathaniel reached out with his free hand, gently wiping the tear away with his thumb. "Then they're all blind." He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her into his arms, strip away the dirty rags and tell her he owned half the city. He wanted to buy her 10 bakeries and shower her in diamonds. But he knew if he told her the truth now, he would terrify her. She would think it was a sick game. He had to show her his world gradually. "There," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's a community charity gala happening this weekend. It's for the neighborhood. I did some sweeping for a guy and he gave me 2 tickets. I know I'm not much to look at, but would you go with me?" Beatrice's eyes widened. "A gala? Nate, I don't have anything to wear to something like that. I don't fit in places like that." "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in his entire life, the mob boss meant every single word. "Please, go with me." Beatrice blushed, a deep crimson spreading across her cheeks. She looked at her sewing machine, then back at him. "Okay, I'll make a dress. I'll go with you." The Sterling Foundation annual gala was the most exclusive event in New York City. Billionaires, politicians, and high-ranking members of various syndicates gathered under the guise of philanthropy to network and cut backroom deals. Nathaniel had engineered it so that Beatrice would receive a neighborhood hero invitation in the mail, alongside his anonymous tickets. On Saturday night, Nathaniel stood outside Beatrice's apartment building. He had compromised slightly on his disguise. He was wearing a clean but incredibly cheap, ill-fitting suit he bought at a thrift store. His hair was washed, though he kept the scruff on his jaw. When Beatrice stepped out of the building, Nathaniel actually forgot how to breathe. She had used her sewing machine to transform yards of emerald green velvet into an incredible sweeping gown. The dress hugged her heavy curves perfectly, cinching at her waist and flowing elegantly to the floor. Her dark hair was pinned up in soft curls, and she wore a subtle, shimmering makeup that accentuated her warm brown eyes. She looked regal, striking, and entirely out of place in the dingy street. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "You look perfect, bae." Beatrice looked down, smoothing the velvet nervously. "You look very handsome, Nate. You clean up well." She linked her arm through his, her soft warmth grounding him. "Are you sure they'll let us in? We don't exactly look like billionaires." "I have a feeling we'll be fine," Nathaniel smiled secretly. He had ordered Dominic to ensure their entry was seamless. When they arrived at the Waldorf Astoria, the snooty doorman glanced at Nathaniel's cheap suit with absolute disdain, ready to turn them away. But from the shadows of the lobby, Dominic caught the doorman's eye and gave a sharp, terrifying nod. The doorman gulped, practically bowing as he ushered Nathaniel and Beatrice inside. The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds, custom tuxedos, and silk gowns. The moment Beatrice and Nathaniel stepped into the light, heads turned. The whispers began almost immediately. The elite of New York were not used to seeing a plus-size woman in homemade velvet on the arm of a man in a polyester suit. Beatrice instinctively shrunk into herself, her grip on Nathaniel's arm tightening. "Nate, they're staring. We shouldn't be here." "Keep your head up," Nathaniel whispered fiercely in her ear, his hand sliding to the small of her back to support her. "You are worth 10 of anyone in this room." "No, not so awkward." He led her to a private table near the back, pulling out her chair like a gentleman. For the first hour, things went smoothly. Beatrice was awestruck by the string quartet in the champagne, her earlier fears melting away as Nathaniel made her laugh with dry, witty observations about the absurdly wealthy guests. But trouble in Nathaniel's world was never far away. Across the room, a stunning woman in a Bacchus silver gown spotted them. It was Victoria Belmont, Nathaniel's ex-fiancée. She had snuck into the gala to find a new, rich target. Victoria didn't recognize Nathaniel in his scruffy state and cheap suit, but she saw an easy target in Beatrice. With a cruel, feline smile, Victoria sauntered over to their table, 2 of her equally shallow friends trailing behind. "Excuse me," Victoria said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby tables. She looked Beatrice up and down with exaggerated disgust. "I think you're in the wrong place. The kitchen staff entrance is in the back." Or did you already eat all the appetizers?" Her friends giggled behind their champagne flutes. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. She looked down at her lap, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to push her chair back. "I should go." Nathaniel's vision swam with red. The absolute fury that possessed him was darker than anything he had felt in the gang war. He stood up slowly, towering over Victoria. His demeanor shifted instantly from the timid, homeless Nate to the apex predator of the New York underworld. "Apologize to her," Nathaniel said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a razor-sharp, freezing authority that made the temperature at the table drop. Victoria scoffed, though she took a half-step back, suddenly unnerved by the terrifying intensity in the cheat-suited man's gray eyes. "Excuse me, do you know who I am, you piece of trash?" Security. Before security could even take a step, the massive double doors of the ballroom blew open with a deafening crash. Screams erupted as 6 men in heavy tactical gear, wearing ski masks and carrying submachine guns, stormed into the gala. It wasn't the Cobras. This was a professional hit squad from the Petrov Bratva, striking at the heart of the Sterling Syndicate while they thought the boss was absent. "Nobody move!" the lead gunman roared, firing a burst into the crystal chandelier. Glass rained down on the screaming billionaires. Chaos reigned. Billionaires threw themselves under tables. Victoria shrieked and dropped to the floor, her silver dress pooling around her. Nathaniel didn't panic. His training took over instantly. He kicked the heavy oak table over, dragging Beatrice down behind the thick wood for cover. "Nate!" Beatrice screamed, covering her ears. "What's happening? Stay down, stay down." "Do not move, Bay," Nathaniel commanded. 2 of the gunmen were advancing down the aisle, checking tables, looking for high-value hostages. They were getting closer. Nathaniel knew his men, led by Dominic, were outside the perimeter and would take at least 60 seconds to breach. By then, the gunman would find them. He couldn't wait. He had to protect her. As a gunman stepped past their overturned table, Nathaniel lunged from the shadows. With brutal, calculated efficiency, he grabbed the barrel of the man's rifle, shoving it upward as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling. In the same motion, Nathaniel drew the hidden blade from his boot, driving it into the gap of the man's body armor. The gunman dropped instantly. Nathaniel snatched the fallen submachine gun, rolled over the table, and unleashed a precise, controlled burst of fire that dropped 2 more attackers across the room. The remaining gunmen turned their fire on him. Bullets chewed through the oak table. Nathaniel ducked back down, breathing heavily, checking his weapons magazine. He turned to Beatrice to make sure she wasn't hit. She was unharmed, but she wasn't cowering anymore. She was staring at him. She looked at the dead gunman bleeding on the carpet. She looked at the military-grade weapon in Nathaniel's hands. She looked at the cold, ruthless, terrifying calm in his eyes. This wasn't a homeless man who got into bar fights. Nate Beatrice breathed, her voice trembling with shock and a creeping terror. Who are you?" Before Nathaniel could answer, the glass windows of the ballroom shattered as Dominic and the heavily armed Sterling enforcers breached the room, swarming the remaining Petrov thugs. Boss! Dominic shouted across the chaotic room, running toward Nathaniel. "Boss, are you hit?" The entire ballroom fell dead silent. The surviving elites, the security, and Victoria all stared in sheer disbelief. The terrifying underboss of the Sterling family had just called the scruffy man in the cheap suit boss. Victoria's jaw dropped open in absolute horror as realization struck her. Nathaniel slowly stood up, dropping the empty rifle. He looked down at Beatrice, who was still huddled on the floor, staring up at him as if he were a monster. The jig was up. The poor, broken man she had cared for was dead, and the billionaire mafia kingpin was standing in his place. "Bay," Nathaniel said, his voice cracking for the first time in his life. "I can explain everything. The ride away from the Waldorf Astoria was a blur of flashing sirens and suffocating silence. Beatrice sat frozen in the back of a heavily armored, bulletproof Maybach. On her left sat Dominic, his tuxedo torn and stained with another man's blood. On her right sat the man she thought she knew. Nathaniel had shed the cheap thrift store jacket. Underneath, he wore a dark tailored shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders, his posture no longer slouched and defeated, but rigid with the authority of a military general. He was barking orders into a satellite phone, coordinating a brutal retaliation against the Petrov Bratva. Beatrice looked down at her homemade velvet dress. It was ruined, torn at the hem and dusted with gunpowder. She felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of humiliation. A test. That's what this had been, a sick, twisted social experiment orchestrated by a billionaire to see how the peasants live. She had cried for him. She had given him her dinners. She had patched his bruised hands in her tiny, drafty apartment, while he secretly possessed the power to buy the entire city block. Nathaniel hung up the phone. The glowing city lights of Manhattan swept over his sharp, aristocratic features as the convoy crossed the bridge toward a heavily fortified private estate in Alpine, New Jersey. He turned to look at her, the lethal coldness in his eyes softening instantly. "Bae, don't," Beatrice whispered, her voice shaking with unshed tears. She pressed herself against a car door as far away from him as possible. "Don't use that name. You don't get to use that name anymore." "Nurse. Badger. Nathaniel flinched, the subtle movement betraying more pain than a bullet wound. "Everything I told you about how I felt. That was real. My name is Nathaniel Sterling. I run the Sterling Syndicate. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking incredibly tired. "I was suffocating. Every woman, every friend, every associate. They only looked at my bank accounts or my power. I needed to know if someone could look at me, just a broken man on the street, and see a human being. You were the only one who passed the test." "Passed the test," Beatrice repeated, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips. "I am not a lab rat, Nathaniel. I am a person. Do you know how much I worried about you? Do you know how many nights I stayed awake wondering if you were freezing to death, while you were probably sleeping in a silk bed laughing at the fat, gullible bakery girl? I never laughed at you." Nathaniel's voice echoed like a gunshot in the confined cabin, making Dominic tense in the front seat. Nathaniel softened his tone, reaching out, but dropping his hand when Beatrice shrank away. "I swear to God I never laughed. You were the only light in the darkest weeks of my life. You are beautiful, Beatrice, inside and out." "You lied to me," she said, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. "You manipulated my empathy because you have none of your own." The Maybach pulled through heavy, wrought-iron gates, surrounded by armed guards with attack dogs. They stopped in front of a sprawling modern mansion of glass and stone. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely terrifying. Once inside, Nathaniel led her to a massive library overlooking the dark wood. He walked over to a mahogany desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick, manila folder. He slid it across the polished wood toward her. "What is this?" she asked, refusing to touch it. "When I realized I was falling in love with you, I had Dominic look into your background," Nathaniel admitted softly. "I know about your mother. I know about the medical debt." Beatrice's stomach dropped. The medical debt from her mother's prolonged battle with ovarian cancer had destroyed her life. It was a crushing weight of $142,000. She worked 60 hours a week just to pay the minimum interest, living on ramen and day-old bread, sacrificing her own health and happiness. "Open it," he urged gently. With trembling hands, Beatrice opened the folder. Inside were official documents from Mount Sinai Hospital, specifically from the billing department of Dr. Melly. Mitchell Evans, the lead oncologist. Stamped across every single page in heavy red ink was one word: paid in full. Attached was a bank transfer receipt. The entire sum had been wired from a private holding company. Beatrice stared at the numbers. The invisible anvil that had been crushing her chest for 3 years vanished. She was free. She wouldn't have to dodge phone calls from collection agencies. She wouldn't have to freeze in the winter to save on heating bills. She looked up at Nathaniel. He was waiting for her to smile, to leap into his arms, to thank him the way the gold diggers in his world would have. Instead, Beatrice carefully closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. "You think this fixes it?" she said, her voice eerily calm. "You think you can just buy my forgiveness? You think throwing 100 grand at me makes up for the fact that you robbed me of my right to choose who I let into my life?" Nathaniel looked genuinely stunned. "Bae, I did this to help you, to take the burden off your shoulders. I didn't want you to struggle anymore." "You don't get it," Beatrice said, standing up, her heavy velvet dress brushing the floor. She stood tall, refusing to let her insecurities shrink her in this massive, intimidating room. "I am not one of your high society escorts, Nathaniel. I don't care about your money. I cared about Nate, and Nate is dead. I want to go home." "You can't," Dominic interjected from the doorway, his voice grave. "With all due respect, Miss Hayes, the Petrovs saw you with the boss tonight. You're no longer a civilian in their eyes. You're a target. If you go back to that apartment, Victor Petrov's men will skin you alive just to send Nathaniel a message. You belong to the syndicate's protection detail now." Beatrice looked between the two men, the horrifying reality of her situation setting in. She wasn't just heartbroken. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. For 3 weeks, Beatrice lived as a ghost in the Alpine mansion. Nathaniel gave her the master suite, moving his own things into a guest room down the hall to give her space. He bought her clothes, not just expensive designer gowns, but comfortable, high-quality sweaters, tailored slacks that actually fit her body, and shoes that didn't pinch her feet. He hired a private chef who cooked incredible, nourishing meals, but Beatrice refused to be bought. She barely spoke to him. When she did, it was polite, distant, and completely devoid of the warmth she had shown the beggar on the street. It was driving Nathaniel insane. He could command an army of ruthless killers, but he couldn't figure out how to make this stubborn, beautiful woman look at him with affection again. "I'm losing my mind, Dom," Nathaniel confessed one evening, pouring a stiff drink at the bar. "She looks at me like I'm a monster." "You are a monster, boss," Dominic replied dryly. "We all are. She's a civilian with a heart of gold. You dragged an angel down into hell. You can't be surprised that she's choking on the smoke." The next morning, Beatrice marched into Nathaniel's office. She looked resolute, wearing one of the oversized sweaters he had bought her. "I'm going back to work," she demanded. Nathaniel stopped typing on his encrypted laptop. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Viktor Petrov is still in the city. We haven't located his main safe house yet." "I don't care," Beatrice snapped, her brown eyes flashing with anger. "Mr. Martin, Harrison is going to fire me if I miss another week. That bakery is the only normal thing I have left in my life. I am not going to sit in this glass box and wait for you to decide when I'm allowed to breathe. I'm going to work, Nathaniel. You can either shoot me to stop me, or you can figure it out." Nathaniel stared at her. The sheer defiance in her face was intoxicating. Any other woman would have cowered in the face of his authority, but Beatrice stood her ground. "Fine," he writted out, "but you do not go anywhere without my men." The return to Sugar and Spice was a surreal nightmare. Beatrice arrived in a black SUV escorted by 2 massive men in tailored suits who took up positions on opposite corners of the street. The moment she walked into the bakery, Peyton dropped a tray of croissants. The thin, vain co-worker stared at Beatrice with a mixture of absolute terror and burning jealousy. "So, the rumors on the street are true," Peyton whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the armed guard visible through the front window. You're with Nathaniel Sterling." "The Nathaniel Sterling? How?" Peyton looked Beatrice up and down, unable to comprehend how the overweight girl she bullied had landed the most powerful, untouchable billionaire in New York. "I'm just here to bake, Peyton," Beatrice said wearily, tying her apron around her waist. Even Mr. Harrison, the tyrannical boss who usually screamed at Beatrice for breathing too loudly, practically bowed when she walked into the kitchen. "Ms. Hayes, please take your time. Anything you need. Fresh ingredients, a raise. Just, please don't let Mr. Sterling shut me down." Beatrice hated it. She hated the fear in their eyes. She wanted respect because she was a hard worker, not because she was sleeping with a warlord. But the fear surrounding her was entirely justified. What Nathaniel didn't know was that there was a rut deep within his own organization. Lorenzo, a trusted caporegine who controlled the Brooklyn docks, had grown tired of Nathaniel's rule. Lorenzo had struck a secret deal with Victor Petrov, helped the Bratva eliminate Nathaniel, and Lorenzo would take over the Sterling Syndicate as a puppet ruler. Lorenzo knew Nathaniel's weakness. He knew the boss had two top-tier enforcers watching the bakery from the outside. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Beatrice returned to work. The bakery was empty save for Beatrice in the back kitchen, kneading dough, trying to find solace in the rhythm of her hands. Peyton had stepped out for a smoke break. Down the street, Lorenzo pulled up in an unmarked car and flashed his syndicate ring to the two guards watching the bakery. "Boss wants you back at the compound." "Immediate recall. I'll take over the watch." Lorenzo lied smoothly. The guards, conditioned to obey the capo, nodded and got into their vehicle, driving away. Lorenzo picked up his radio. "The perimeter is clear. Burn it down." Inside the kitchen, Beatrice was just sliding a tray of cinnamon rolls into the massive industrial oven when she heard the shattering of glass in the front of the shop. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and walked toward the swinging doors. "Peyton, did you drop?" The front of Sugar and Spice was engulfed in a roaring wall of unnatural chemical fire. 3 Molotov cocktails had been hurled through the display windows. The ancient dry wood of the bakery caught instantly. Black toxic smoke billowed to the ceiling, choking the air. Beatrice screamed, coughing violently as she backed away. She ran for the back exit, the same door Nathaniel had kicked open weeks ago to save her from the street gang. She grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It had been chained and padlocked from the outside. She was trapped. Panic seized her chest. The heat was unbearable, blistering her skin. The fire was spreading rapidly toward the kitchen, eating through the drywall and catching the bags of flour, causing small, explosive bursts of flame. "Help!" she screamed, banging her fists against the reinforced steel back door. "Please, help me!" The ceiling above the ovens groaned ominously. The structural beams of the old building were failing. Beatrice fell to her knees, the smoke sinking lower, burning her lungs. Her vision began to blur as a massive flaming support beam crashed down, blocking her only path back to the front of the store. Beatrice curled into a ball on the tile floor, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. She thought of her mother. She thought of the unfairness of it all. And, to her own bitter surprise, her final thought was of Nathaniel's piercing grey eyes. Suddenly, a deafening roar echoed over the crackle of the flames. It wasn't the sound of the building collapsing. It was the sound of a heavy, armored vehicle driving straight through the front of the burning bakery. Nathaniel's Maybach, its front grille smashed and smoking, sat in the middle of the ruined storefront. The driver's side door kicked open. Nathaniel stepped out into the inferno. He didn't wear tactical gear. He wore a ruined, bespoke suit. His eyes were wild, entirely devoid of their usual calculated calm. He looked like a demon walking through his own domain. Beatrice. His voice tore through the roar of the fire, raw and desperate. He waded through the flames, ignoring the fire licking at his expensive shoes and the sleeves of his jacket. He found her in the back kitchen, unconscious on the floor, trapped behind the burning debris of the fallen ceiling beam. Without a second of hesitation, Nathaniel grabbed the burning wooden beam with his bare hands. He roared in agony as the wood seared his flesh, but fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and terror, he heaved the massive timber aside. He dropped to his knees, scooping Beatrice's heavy, limp body into his arms, as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He pressed her face into his chest, shielding her from the smoke, and ran blindly back through the fire, kicking debris out of the way until he burst out into the cool, raining alleyway where Dominic and a swarm of syndicate soldiers had just arrived. "Get a medic, now!" "Mars!" Nathaniel bellowed, laying Beatrice gently on the wet asphalt. His hands were horrifically burned, blistered, and bleeding, but he didn't care. He ripped his ruined jacket off and pressed his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was faint, but it was there. She coughed weakly, her chest heaving as she sucked in the fresh, rain-filled air. Beatrice fluttered her eyes open. Her vision was blurry, but she could see Nathaniel hovering over her. His face was covered in soot, his eyes wide with a frantic, terrifying vulnerability. He looked exactly like the broken, desperate man she had found on the street weeks ago. "Nate," she rasped, her throat raw from the smoke. "I'm here, Bea. I've got you." "I've got you," he chanted, pressing his forehead against hers, uncaring of the dozens of armed men surrounding them. Beatrice looked at his hands. They were ruined, burned severely from lifting the beam off her. He had literally walked through fire and burned himself alive just to save her. As the private ambulance arrived and the paramedics rushed forward, Beatrice reached up with a weak, trembling hand and touched his soot-stained cheek. "If I stay with you," she whispered, her tears mixing with the rain, "I have to become a monster too, don't I?" Nathaniel looked down at her, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. He didn't lie to her, not this time. "Yes," he whispered back, his voice trembling, "but I will burn the whole world down before I let the flames touch you again." For a man who held the New York underworld by the throat, being unable to hold a glass of water was a unique kind of torture. Nathaniel sat in the dim light of the mansion's medical wing, his forearms resting on the arms of a leather chair. Both of his hands were wrapped in thick, white, sterile gauze from his wrists to his fingertips. The second-degree burns were agonizing, a constant throbbing reminder of the fire, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that still gripped his chest every time he closed his eyes and saw the burning bakery roof collapsing toward Beatrice. The heavy oak door clicked open. Beatrice walked in, carrying a silver tray. She wore a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the strands, but her face was clean and her eyes held a new, steely resolve. She set the tray on the side table. It held a bowl of hot chicken broth and a glass of water with a straw. "Dominic says you refused the pain medication again," Beatrice said quietly, pulling up a stool beside him. "It clouds my head," Nathaniel rasped, his voice rough. "I have a war to plan, Bea. I can't afford to be sedated while Victor Petrov is breathing the same air as you." Beatrice didn't argue. Instead, she picked up the spoon, blew gently on the broth, and lifted it to his lips. Nathaniel hesitated, his pride warring with his absolute devotion to the woman in front of him. He parted his lips and took the soup. "Funny, isn't it?" Beatrice murmured, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of his jaw. "A month ago, I was feeding you hot soup in an alleyway because I thought you were freezing. Now I'm feeding you in a billionaire's fortress because you walked through fire for me." "I'd do it again," Nathaniel said, holding her gaze, the gray in his eyes darkening. "I'd burn to ash if it meant you got out." Beatrice's breath hitched. She set the spoon down and gently placed her soft, cool palms over his heavily bandaged wrists. "You don't have to burn anymore, Nathaniel. And you don't have to lie to me." "Who set the fire?" Nathaniel looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "Petrov's men. But they shouldn't have been able to get within a mile of that bakery. I had 2 of my best enforcers on the perimeter. Someone called them off. Someone on the inside. The man in the charcoal suit, Beatrice said suddenly. Nathaniel snapped his head back to her, wincing at the sudden movement. What man? Right before the fire started, Beatrice explained, her brow furrowing as she pulled the memory from the chaotic haze of that afternoon. I looked out the front window. Peyton was on her smoke break. A black car pulled up. A man in a tailored charcoal suit got out. He flashed something to your guards, a heavy gold ring with a black stone just like the one you wore to the gala. Your guards nodded and drove away. 10 minutes later the firebombs came through the window. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. A gold ring with a black onyx stone. An eagle carved into the band. Yes, Beatrice nodded firmly. He had a silver scar through his left eyebrow. Lorenzo, Nathaniel whispered, the name tasting like venom on his tongue. Lorenzo was his right hand in Brookton, a copper regime he had trusted with his life for a decade. The betrayal cut deep, but the clarity it brought was razor-sharp. Lorenzo had sold him out to the Bratva. Nathaniel tried to stand, a surge of adrenaline masking the pain in his hands. Dominic, get in here. The underboss entered the room instantly, taking one look at Nathaniel's murderous expression and placing a hand on his holstered weapon. Boss, it's Lorenzo, Nathaniel growled, his voice vibrating with absolute, lethal authority. He pulled the guards. He's working with Petrov. I want his communications tapped. I want his safe houses surrounded, and I want him breathing only until I say otherwise. Done, Dominic said, a terrifying grin spreading across his face. He turned to leave, but stopped, looking back at Beatrice. The underboss gave her a slow, deep nod of profound respect. She had just solved the leak that had been paralyzing the syndicate. As the door closed, Nathaniel looked at Beatrice. The innocent, terrified baker was gone. In her place sat a woman who had just ordered a hit on a mafia captain without flinching. You didn't have to tell me that, Bea, Nathaniel said softly. You know what I'm going to do to him. He tried to burn me alive, Beatrice said, a voice eerily calm, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. He tried to take you away from me. I told you, Nathaniel, if I stay, I have to embrace the monster. She stood up, smoothing her dress, her heavy curves casting a beautiful, imposing silhouette against the lamplight. So how do we end this? The trap was set with terrifying precision. 3 nights later, Lorenzo was summoned to a secret meeting with Viktor Petrov at an abandoned shipping warehouse on the Brooklyn docks, Lorenzo's own territory. Lorenzo thought he was arriving to finalize the assassination of the injured and weak Nathaniel Sterling. Instead, when Lorenzo and Viktor Petrov shook hands in the center of the damp, echoing warehouse, the massive steel doors slammed shut, locking them inside with 20 of their men. The floodlights overhead snapped on, blinding the traitors and the Bratva thugs. From the shadows of the catwalk above, Nathaniel Sterling emerged. He wasn't in a hospital bed. He wore a pristine, pitch-black suit. His hands were wrapped in sleek black leather gloves to protect his healing burns, making him look even more menacing. Standing to his immediate right, holding a suppressed pistol with a calm, practiced grip, was Dominic. And standing to his left, wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored trench coat that flowed perfectly over her figure, was Beatrice. Lorenzo's jaw dropped. Viktor Petrov reached for his weapon, but a dozen red laser sights instantly painted his chest. The entire warehouse was surrounded by Sterling enforcers. Lorenzo, Nathaniel's voice echoed through the cavernous space, cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. You broke bread at my table, you kissed my ring, and then you tried to burn the woman I love. Nate, wait, it's not what it looks like. Lorenzo shouted, backing away, panic finally breaking his slick facade. Petrov forced me. He threatened my family. You're a liar, Beatrice's voice rang out. The entire warehouse fell silent. The men below stared up at the plus-size woman commanding the high ground beside the most feared man in the city. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide her body or lower her eyes. She looked down at Lorenzo with the absolute authority of a queen judging a peasant. I saw you smile when my guards drove away. You wanted the bakery to burn. Nathaniel didn't need to hear anything else. He didn't monologue, he didn't offer a dramatic countdown. He simply turned to Dominic and gave a single imperceptible nod. The gunfire lasted exactly 14 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Lorenzo, Victor Petrov, and the treacherous Bratva soldiers lay motionless on the concrete floor. The war was over. The Sterling Syndicate was absolute. Nathaniel turned to Beatrice. The deafening noise of the execution should have sent her running. But she just looked at him, exhaled a long breath, and took his black-gloved hand in hers. "Let's go home," she whispered. 6 months later, the morning sun hit the gold-leaf lettering on the window of the newest, most exclusive bakery in Manhattan, Sterling and Spice. The line wrapped around the block. Inside, the bakery was a masterpiece of marble counters, crystal chandeliers, and the intoxicating scent of genuine artisanal French pastries. Behind the counter stood Beatrice Sterling. She wore a stunning, tailored white chef's coat that cinched at her waist, proudly displaying her curves. Her hair was perfectly styled, a massive, flawless diamond glittering on her left hand. She was radiant, confident, and completely untouchable. The bell chimed, and a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit shuffled in, accompanied by a painfully thin woman carrying a battered resume. It was Mr. Harrison and Peyton. Their old bakery had never recovered after the fire, and they had been blacklisted from every decent culinary job in the city. They had come to beg for work at the hottest new establishment in town, unaware of who owned it. When Peyton looked up and saw Beatrice standing behind the counter, all the color drained from her face. Beatrice, Peyton stammered, her eyes darting from Beatrice's glowing, confident face to the massive diamond, and finally to the 2 towering men in dark suits standing quietly by the back door. "It's Mrs. Sterling now, Peyton," Beatrice said, a voice smooth and sweet as buttercream, lacking any of the anxiety that used to choke her. She picked up a delicate macaron and placed it in a gold box. We saw you were hiring, Mr. Harrison choked out, sweating profusely. "Beatrice, please, we're desperate. I know we had our differences in the past, but differences—" Beatrice interrupted softly, leaning against the marble counter. "You paid me minimum wage while I ran your entire business, Harrison. And Peyton, you spent 3 years telling me I was too fat to be loved, too ugly to succeed, and too worthless to matter." Peyton swallowed hard, taking a step back toward the door. I was just joking around, Bay. And I'm just telling you to get out," Beatrice said, her smile never wavering, though her eyes were chips of brown ice. "Before I have my husband's men escort you to the river. You have 10 seconds." Harrison and Peyton practically tripped over themselves running out the door. Beatrice chuckled softly, wiping her hands on the towel. Suddenly, strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. A warm chest pressed against her back, and a familiar deep voice murmured against her neck. "You could have let Dominic throw them out." Nathaniel kissed the skin beneath her ear, sending shivers down her spine. He wore a perfectly tailored slate-gray suit, looking every inch the billionaire king of New York. The scars on his hands were fading, but Beatrice kissed them every single night. "I preferred to handle my own trash," Beatrice smiled, leaning back into his embrace, completely comfortable in her own skin, in her body and in her life. She turned in his arms, wrapping her hands around his neck. "Besides, I'm the queen of the syndicate now. I have a reputation to maintain." Nathaniel looked down at her, his eyes entirely devoid of the cold, dead emptiness that used to haunt him. He had stripped away his wealth, his power, and his name to find a heart pure enough to love him. He had found it in a brilliant, beautiful woman who society had overlooked. "You're the queen of everything, Bea," Nathaniel whispered, pulling her in for a slow, deep kiss that made the rest of the world melt away. "And I am exactly where I belong." And that, my friends, is the ultimate proof that true beauty and loyalty aren't found in a designer label or a perfect waistline, but in the strength of the person's soul. Beatrice Hayes went from being a bullied, struntling baker to the most powerful woman in New York, proving that when you lead with kindness, the universe or a billionaire mob boss eventually pays you back in full. Nathaniel found the only thing his money couldn't buy: a love that didn't care about his bank account. What would you do if you realized the person you were helping was secretly the most dangerous man in the city? Would you run, or would you take the throne? Let us know in the comments. If you loved this journey of revenge, romance, and redemption, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their worth. Subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss our next high-stakes story. See you in the next one.